My name is Bert Forster. I'm from the Medical College of Wisconsin, Department of Physiology. And this is March 29th, and I'm here to interview Dr. Robert Bob Fitzgerald, who is from the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. Bob, it's a real pleasure to be here chatting with you today. Can you tell us about, your upbringing, your child life, where you grew up, your parents, your siblings?
Well, when you get to be my age, Bert, it's always fun to look back on those moments. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, where my grandfather happened to be mayor of Detroit when Henry Ford first started to mass produce the automobile. And one of the pictures I have of him, he's standing with William Jennings Bryan, a Democratic candidate for presidency at that time, in Detroit Tiger baseball. Anyways, that's the grandfather. My father was a physician, and I was born there. And then my father, incidentally, was an all-city basketball player in Detroit. And I bring that up because in my family, the whole theme was academics and athletics. And that's the way we lived our lives. My brother is an excellent golfer, by the way. Anyways, before the Second World War started, my dad entered the Navy as a physician. He eventually became the senior medical officer on a troop transport in the South Pacific. He was at several major engagements, the invasion of New Britain, Guam, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and the reinvasion of the Philippine Islands. When he came out, he set up practice in Port Huron, Michigan, which is northeast of Detroit, right on the lake. And that's where we grew up. I went to grammar school, all the Catholic parochial schools in Detroit and in Toledo, Ohio, he was temporarily stationed there. But then you'd be interested in this, Bert, because I went to Campion Jesuit High School in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and had a wonderful 4 years there. And then I went to Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame, where I played baseball. And one of the great moments of my life was a tryout I had with the New York Yankees. And when they found out that I was 16 years old, an old Yankees coach, old third base coach, Burley Grimes was his name. He said, "Hey kid, get out of here. We can't touch kids that aren't out of high school yet." So those are great memories, which I recall. And the only reason I got to play at Notre Dame is I got a beautiful letter of recommendation from a scout for the St. Louis Cardinals. Well, I've got an older brother who's a physician, and my younger sister was a school teacher at the ski school in Vermont. She has since retired. My brother is still practicing medicine. He's 2 years older than I am. And after that time at Notre Dame, I entered the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, which has got a huge investment in education in the United States. In fact, you're a member of the Medical College of Wisconsin. That used to be the medical school for Marquette University, a Jesuit university. So I went through the usual course of training, which was involved 2 years of liberal arts study. And because I had Latin and Greek in high school at Campion, and I had a year at Notre Dame, I was able to pick up this first degree, as I remarked to you in my little synopsis. I'm educated considerably beyond my talents. but I say that in all honesty, because I still feel woefully ignorant in many areas, but I relish the opportunity I had to read in Greek big sections of the Odyssey, big sections of the Iliad, Sophocles, Oedipus, Euripides' Medea, Plato's Apology, some of Aristotle, and Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's Odes, and so forth. And they say, "Oh, you're just boasting." I'm not boasting. I'm just saying how grateful I am to have had those, because they gave me a background that kind of give you an expansive look. Now I'm very cosmological in my outlook. I did that. Then the second part of the Jesuit training was I went to Spring Hill College, which is a a Jesuit institution. There was the Jesuit House of Studies there, where I picked up a master's degree in philosophy. Tried to tackle the philosophy of science of Alfred North Whitehead, but it was using a language. I look at that thing now and I wonder, what was I saying? What could I possibly have meant by that? So then I went to, I taught for 2 years in a Jesuit high school, St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, and taught there for a couple of years. Then I went to the University of Chicago for my doctorate in physiology and worked with Dr. John Forbes Perkins. And the superior of the Jesuits said, Bob, you better find a place where you can continue some postdoctoral studies while you're studying theology, otherwise you'll forget it all. So I looked around and I found an outstanding Jesuit School of Theology in Woodstock, Maryland. And so I got John Perkins to investigate, was there anybody at Hopkins that I could work with? So I got into the laboratory of Dick Riley and Saul Permit. Those are great names at that time. In the School of Public Health, the department was called Environmental Medicine. So while I was studying theology, I was doing postdoctoral work part-time at Hopkins. And the last year of those studies, during my time at Chicago, it was interesting. Pierre de Jour, a very famous name in respiratory control, came to Chicago. He was interested in what I was doing because he had made some observations in human subjects involving the carotid body. And when he found that I was selectively perfusing the carotid body in dogs, he wanted to know, well, what did that show you? So he came and he said, well, Bob, can we do an experiment? I said, well, sure, I'll be glad. Here, I'm a little graduate student. This is Pierre de Jour, you know. So we did an experiment. It was probably the best of the group that I did. And he said, well, listen, Bob, if you ever come to Europe, just know you can come to my lab, do whatever you want, stay as long as you want, and I'll pay you. And I thought, man, with an offer like that, who can pass that up? So the last year of Jesuit training involved my going to Europe for a period of spiritual training, and I went to Belgium. Incidentally, that's just outside of Ghent. And Ghent is where the man who won the Nobel Prize for discovering the carotid body, Corneille Haymans. Very active place, a very active place. He's a nice guy too. And then in the middle of that spiritual training, the superior there said, look, you guys all come from these big Jesuit houses. You're never going to live that way again. I want you to go out and get a job, and I'll come and visit you. So I thought, oh man, I'm going to call Pierre de Jour. So I went to Paris and I worked in Pierre de Jour's lab with Michel Leitner. And I was at the Hôpital Marie Lanelong, tout près Place d'Italie. And we did, in fact, I was just talking about that this morning with Chi Sang Poon, and telling him what I did there and how it related to what we were talking about. So I stayed there for, from mid-January to the end of July. Then I came back and was full-time at Hopkins. Dick Riley gave me an appointment before I left because he wanted me to come back to Hopkins. So I came back and I was at Hopkins. I've been at Hopkins ever since. With 1 year, I went out to UCSF, to the CVRI, and worked with Bob Mitchell on recording what we called single fiber carotid body preparations. So that kind of covers the whole background, the educational background.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back for a moment to high school, because if I remember correctly, the Campion High School in Prairie du Chien is a boarding school.
That's right.
Right. So you talked about your family and athletics and academics, but it wasn't. It must have been the aura of your family, because it wasn't the everyday presence of your parents and your siblings that instilled this, because you basically were several hours away from where they were in Michigan or Ohio at that time. And at that time, was that an all men's school?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All boys.
Yeah.
That was four of the best years of my life. I spent at Campion.
Yeah.
And I was a big time athlete, football, basketball, baseball, and we used to travel. Well, we got Mesmer High of Milwaukee. We played them in a basketball tournament. St. Catherine's of Racine, St. Patrick's of Eau Claire, um, St. Mary's of Menasha. We played in a tournament with St. Norbert's in West Appear.
Assumption in Wisconsin Rapids, I believe.
No.
No, that must have been later on. But anyway, I bring it up because I coached football for 2 years at a Catholic high school in Chippewa Falls. McDonald,
yes.
right. And I mean, Prairie du Chien Campion was the premier team. I was a little bit later than you, but still, Prairie du Chien had their reputation. And since then, you know, I mean, the school is now closed.
Yes,
but you know, it always was an outstanding institution.
Well,
so
thank you.
I just thought I would have you elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, St. Aquinas High of La Crosse.
Right. Yeah.
Was another one.
Yeah. Yeah. Then the another thing that as you were talking, you talked about you know, your studies with Perkins, and your work and Pierre de Jures there, you know, and your studies in must have been late 50s or 60s. I think it's published in the early 60s, where you perfuse boluses of high CO2 into the carotid artery and got a nice response, pretty much the same as if you injected cyanide. I think that was one of the strongest evidence that that the carotid chemoreceptors do respond to CO2, because there was a big controversy at that time. Fensel and Pappenheimer and even Combrel were you know, they were saying something different. But your studies really, I think, were very definitive in that point.
Thank you, Bert. But I would just be quick to add that the people of Wisconsin, including yourself, had contributed so substantially to that story subsequently.
Yeah, I know, but it's subsequent to what you did, Bob. You you were there first, so you got us started on that. You know, how did your interest in research develop?
Well, that's a good question. I've asked myself that, and it really has come to the fore in my later years. I mean, I always had this idea, but I'm thinking how appropriate it was has impressed me in my later years. I was interested in energy metabolism. Energy metabolism is so intimately dependent upon the mitochondria, because that's where you get your ATP. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why I went into respiration, because you do need to get the oxygen down to that mitochondrium for that last step in the electron transport chain. So I think that's what drew me to John Perkins. Besides the fact he was a very nice guy, John was a prince of a person. And I think I was his last graduate student, as a matter of fact. Dario Domisi preceded me and did some very wonderful work with John. But it all comes down to energy, because without energy, your heart won't beat, you can't think, nothing goes on without energy. And that's why I got interested in the control of respiration. Mm-hmm. What's going to keep that oxygen coming in across the alveolar surface and having the blood carried out to the periphery?
Okay, but Bob, you know, why didn't you go into law? Why didn't you go into medicine like your father? Why didn't you go into business? You're obviously a very talented person. You could have succeeded in all of these. Why was it research, academia?
Well, I've always been intensely curious. I think that's why at Campion you had a choice after your second year. You could go into the Latin scientific or into the classical curriculum. And I thought, I wonder what Greek is all about. So I went into the classical curriculum, and that's where we read the large sections of the Odyssey and then the Medea. And I was so pleased and proud and deep satisfaction that I could really read Greek. And so that set aside my curiosity. Mm-hmm. Then going into biomedical science, I think I was led on the by my older brother, who's always been my role model. He taught me, I would say he taught me everything I knew in a sense, but that's overstating it a little bit. He went to Campion too. He graduated from Campion, and the reason for that was we were living in Toledo at the time because we had moved to Toledo because my father, he entered the Navy in July 1941, and he got assigned to Toledo in January of 1942. That was it. And then he went to sea after that in late 42. But he insisted that his two sons, because he was Jesuit educated, University of Detroit High School, University of Detroit, St. Louis U Medical School, all Jesuit institutions. So he wanted his sons to be exposed to Jesuit education, and there was nothing in Toledo. My brother spent his first year at Catholic Central in Toledo. So he went off to Campion, then I followed him, and then he went to Notre Dame, so I followed him, and he, from his time he was just a kid, he wanted to be a physician. So I started out in pre-med at Notre Dame. And then, for a variety of reasons, I thought, well, and it was again the experience at Campion. The Jesuit education, after 7 years, they send their seminarians out to teach. And we had such a wonderful group of guys. They were urbane, they were smart, they were good athletes, they really had a powerful influence on us. And I thought to myself as I came to my senior year, what a wonderful way to spend your life, educating or having the influence on kids that these guys have. I think I'll try that, and I pushed it away. I don't want to do that. You got to give up too much, So I kind of pushed that aside until finally, after Notre Dame, I thought, no, I've got to try that out. I've got to try that out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Bob, was there within you a struggle, as decisive, indecisive moments of a purely a career in the clergy, or a calling in the clergy versus in the sciences? How was that an issue for you?
Yes, Bert, it certainly was, and that's why I eventually left the Jesuits. Mm-hmm. At the time, I was struggling with that. And the reason I was struggling, it was because of two issues. One was the hypocrisy, or what I felt was the hypocrisy of the hierarchy with respect to the Vietnam conflict. They could get together on something like birth control and send out this document from the bishops of the United States forbidding artificial contraception. But when it came to the conflict in Vietnam, I'd been taught what are the criteria that have to be met to establish a war as a just war. None of those were being met in Vietnam, and yet you never heard the group of bishops, an individual bishop here or there, spoke out against our conflict and our being there. But the group never did. And I thought, well, you've got to be able to sustain a certain amount of hypocrisy in any organization, even in your own life, I'm aware of that. But this, I thought, no. The amount of lives that are being lost, the amount of materials that's being wasted, no. And the second thing that drove me away was the forbidding of artificial contraception. There is nothing in theology, scripture, that forbids artificial contraception. And although there could be something in Aristotelian philosophy that might say, no, you ought not do that. You're frustrating a natural faculty. I say, we frustrate natural faculties all over the place, and what the heck is the rhythm theory? You're doing the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I had to say, so those two things with that, and in consultation, I explained my conflict to the provincial of the Maryland province where I was located. And finally he just said, Bob, I don't see how you can stay. And I said, well, Jim, I'm glad to hear you say that, but even if I do not say that, I think I really have to step out. Mm-hmm. So that's why I left.
It's incredible, Bob. I'll bring this out, even though this is, your story. The parallels between you and I, because I was, raised Catholic, and my parents and my aunt, who was a nun, they were convinced that I should be a priest, and I never went as far as you did, because I just couldn't see that I could do that type of thing with everything else that I was interested in and everything else that I believe. So
Well, that's interesting.
I totally appreciate and understand, you know.
Well, I was a Jesuit for 22 years, and there were things that I enjoyed doing as a priest. I enjoyed preaching because I'd been educated, as I say, beyond. Oh, and I could share that. I could share that with people. I used to take great pains with the homilies that I had to construct, because here I've got I don't want to say a captive audience, but people that were interested, and people appreciated it. They'd really appreciate it. The second thing was hearing confessions. At that time was much more. You could really be Jesus of Nazareth and be merciful to these people, you know. And I enjoyed being able to do that. But being in there, a priest, in order to hear confessions or to preach, as a matter of fact, he has to get faculties from the bishop. And I said, I don't want to be dependent upon a bishop. I just have no respect for them whatsoever. So.
Okay, moving away or back to, I am often asked, what is the most important characteristic criteria for success in research or success in academia? Are you asked that? And I guess I would ask you, what's your view on that?
Let me quote St. Thomas Aquinas, because it's always been meaningful to me. He was asked, Thomas, what's the greatest intellectual virtue? He said, curiosity. He said, well, what's the greatest intellectual vice? Curiosity. And I think that's true. I think that's really true. So just, searching, people say with all that education, you must be very smart. I said, no. I'm not smart. I'm very knowledgeable because I've been blessed with a remarkable memory, and I was smart enough to pay attention in all the educational experiences I've had. So I'm very knowledgeable, but that's not very smart. A smart person is a person who's creative. They can two planes of reality, bring them together in a way. I've got a montage at home based on Arthur Koestler's The Act of Creation, in which he says, science, art, and humor are great acts of creation, because there's that explosive moment when the artist says, ah, and the scientist says, eureka, and the other one was, ha, the joke. He uses the joke to women in a supermarket, and they say, Rachel, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, Ruth, I'm fine, but my boy is not feeling well. Oh, really? Well, did you take him to a doctor? Yes, I took him to the psychiatrist. Really? He said, yes. And the psychiatrist talks, and she says, oh, the psychiatrist, just as long as he's a good boy and loves his mother, that's all. He's okay. Have Oedipus complex.
Anyway, Bob, when I'm asked that, what's the most important criteria, it's the same thing, but I always say that you have to have a passion for learning. And that, to me, it says the same thing as a curiosity.
Yeah.
If you have that, if you don't have that, no matter how so-called smart you are, no matter how hard you work, you're not going to get very far. But if you have curiosity or creativeness or a passion for learning, you've got a good chance.
I totally agree with you, Bert. I totally agree with you. My son is a soccer player. Mm-hmm. He's a goalkeeper. Mm-hmm. He just was recruited into the MLS. Mm-hmm. He's playing for the NYCFC, New York City Football Club. Mm-hmm. He's a goalkeeper. And I coached him and so forth, and I've also coached other situations, not like you at Campion, but I did coach freshman basketball at St. Ignatius when I was there. But I say there are three elements that I think they also apply to a scientific career. Intensity, your passion. Intensity, focus, and discipline. You have to those three elements, and because talent in athletics is not enough. Mm-hmm. It's not enough. Yeah. Just as the talent, as you've remarked, in science, it's not enough. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Intensity, focus, and discipline.
Mm-hmm. So, Bob, Your first APS, your first meeting, can you remember what year, where was it?
It, I remember very well because it was cold, windy, and wet. We were in Atlantic City.
Yeah.
It was called FASIB then.
FASIB, yeah.
FASIB meeting, and that was 1960. And I went there with John Perkins and with a fellow with whom I worked, who was also in John's lab, Otto Talenius. And he had done work that was way ahead of his time. In unanesthetized dogs, he was measuring the response of the pulmonary vasculature to hypoxia. These were in unanesthetized dogs, and I helped him train the dogs and held the dogs as we were using cardial green to measure cardiac output. And he had catheters all over the place, measuring pressures and so forth. And we did those experiments, and I did not present at that meeting in 1960, but I attended, and I was at Otto's presentation. And I remember, who was it? Simeon Margolis, I think, got up in the back, and he asked a question, and I could barely understand him. And poor Otto was up there standing behind the podium, and he said, "Would you repeat the question, please?" So he did, and again, it wasn't so fine. And then he just said, "Well, I'll talk with you afterwards." And Otto said afterwards, he said, "I was getting ready to faint. I didn't know what to do because I couldn't understand him."
Yeah, so at that time, these meetings were all in Atlantic City,
Yes.
except every few years they would have them in Chicago. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. And in 1967 was my first FASIB meeting, and that was in Chicago, and we met at that meeting, and we met at a get-together that evening that has eventually morphed into what is now called the non-annual control of breathing mixture, and I think it was held again last night. The 48th year of it. It's called non-annual because it's, for some reason, there was one year that it was skipped, but
I remember that meeting. Well, I can't say that, Bert. I can remember the meeting in Chicago. The big meeting was held in McCormick Place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we, with Sukumai Lahiri, the late Sukumai Lahiri, a great investigator and a very, very good friend of mine. We published together, and we organized the control of respiration, and it started out a couple of times as kind of a cash bar with hors d'oeuvres or something. I remember putting on a dinner in Chicago with him. I was the president-elect or something, and then the next year I became the president, and then a second dinner we put on in San Francisco at the meeting, and I've attended all of them. I'm sorry I couldn't make the one last night. But and I'm so pleased that younger people are taking over that, because it's still a huge area of research.
Yeah. Well, the room was full last night. I mean, and there must have been 20, presentations, going anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. And so, I mean, it was.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So, the characters that you've met in science, or you mentioned some of them. I mean, Richard Riley, Saul Permute. I mean, these are characters, great guys.
They are.
And can you expand on that a little bit, and others that you can think of? I mean, I know you were in San Francisco for a year. There were a lot of characters there.
Yes. Yeah. Well, people that have impressed me tremendously was, of course, Dick Riley and Saul. The waterfall hypothesis, the pulmonary waterfall, is at least in part a creation of Saul and Dick Riley's. Then working with Bob Mitchell, he taught me so much. And while I was there, I became very familiar with John Severinghaus. And John is such a great contributor to respiratory physiology, my goodness. And Norman Staub, Donald McDonald, was
Coleridge's? John and Hazel Coleridge?
John and Hazel Coleridge
Yeah.
were there. I didn't much interact with them at that time, but they were there. Oh, and then that's where I experienced my first earthquake. Was in San Francisco. Julius Comroe used to have these Monday morning meetings on control of respiration, mostly on the carotid body or chemoreceptors. And Bob Mitchell was up there making his presentation, and I looked up there and the room started to go back and forth. And he looked and I said, I think we're having an earthquake. And we were. But he was great to work with, Bob Mitchell. He was so, and Al Berger. Al Berger was a graduate student in Bob Mitchell's lab at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I went, in 1966, I went out and worked in Tom Hornbein's lab in the Department of Anesthesiology. And
was that in Seattle at that time?
in Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he said, well, listen, you want to climb a mountain? And I said, Tom, I've never done that. He said, we'll go with Jim Whittaker, who led the American expedition up Mount Everest. So I said, well, okay. So it was Tom, a surgeon, and myself. And we went out to the Snoqualmie Pass, west or east of Seattle, to climb a mountain called the Tooth. And we had to traverse in to the base of the mountain. I thought, am I really tired? He said, well, we've just started. He said, the rest is easy. And I looked up. Well, we had to, put in we had to belay, and so forth. So we struggled up there, and there was halfway up, there was this cave. And so Tom went out, and then the surgeon, he said, okay, you're on belay. I thought, wonderful, whatever that means. I guess it means I got to get out of this cave. So he got up to the top, and we started looking around. He said, well, now, Bob, isn't it worth it? And I said, no. But when I got down and was drinking out of a stream at the bottom and looked up to see where I've been, I said, now it's worth it. Now it's worth it. So that was a great experience. And the summer I worked, before I worked with Pierre de Jour, I worked with Pierre Bouvreau.
Right, okay.
In the summer of that, because I went from Baltimore to Paris thinking I was going to work immediately in Pierre de Jour's lab. He said, I can't do it right now. But he said, I got out at Nancy, Université de Nancy. Pierre Bouvreau would love to have you come out. So what we did out there, we put unanesthetized dogs in a plethysmograph. We were measuring what happens to their FRC under conditions of hypoxia. And it was just great. Pierre was wonderful. His wife, Danielle, was getting a doctorat d'etat. That's the highest degree in France in language and linguistics. And I could speak a little French and understand a little, but anyways, we worked every day during the month of July. And the way we measured, we put the dog in the box, and these weren't lucite chambers, these were wooden boxes. So the dog went in total darkness, but he had trained them very well. So we connected their endotracheal tube to this pressure transducer, and the way we measured it, we had these rice paper circles that we put into a oscillograph on the screen of an oscillograph, and we could measure the slope and the pressure volume, so forth. So that was a great experience, and he was a wonderful guy, Pierre Bouvreau, just great. So let's see. I could go on and talk. But
well, let me ask you this. I know you still teach,
yes.
right? So you still interact with students.
Mm-hmm.
What's your counsel? What do you tell students? How should they be thinking about a career in the science, or a productive life, a happy life?
Well, good question, Bert. I've just finished one seminar on teaching mechanisms in cardiopulmonary control, in which I had 33 students. That's very large for a seminar. And the one I'm currently in term 4 is the cardiopulmonary system under stress. And the students, they've got 23 students in that. I said, but now this is a different course. I said, what I want to tell you is I want you to deeply appreciate this cardiopulmonary system. Now, you've all got A's until you prove to me you don't want it. I said, my view of education is you go from facts to knowledge, to understanding, to appreciation, to creativity. That's the way I want you to go. Now, you're going to end up at the end of this course. There are no tests in this course. I don't want you staying up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, biting your fingernails, getting ready to give back in a multiple choice or a fill-in type test. I want you to write me an essay, 1.5 pages maximum. I won't read more than 1.5 pages. And tell me what mechanism introduced you and made you deeply appreciate the cardiopulmonary system and what it's supposed to do, which is to capture oxygen from the environment and deliver it to the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. I got some wonderful essays, and the same thing. So it's trying to get them to step back and take a look at the forest, but then go in and look at the individual trees. So go in, pray. So that's what I enjoy doing a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think that the best part of the essays were not only were they interesting, because they relate them. Oh, several were on emergency medical crews, and they integrated what they were taught in this course with their experiences. And I said, okay, that's great. That's what I want you to do. Your understanding, I want you to appreciate, not just regurgitate facts. The facts are important. You've got to go through those exams where you got to, but I want you to know that you have to appreciate what you've learned and be able to integrate it more broadly.
Mm-hmm. So, as you well know, a lot of people get really stressed out about grants, about funding.
Oh, yes.
What is your view about writing grants? Are you one of those that really got stressed out about it? Or did you enjoy writing a grant?
I enjoyed it while I thought I was capable of getting it. The last grant, the last RO1 I had, started in 1993 and went until 2010. And then I got a 2-year no-cost extension. And then I said, okay, at my age, it'd be useless for me to write a grant because they won't fund it. I'm too old. And I don't necessarily fault them for that. I think there's a mistake here. But I said, Congress gave the NIH a mandate that they should fund the younger investigators. I say, hooray, you do that. Because we want to have younger investigators able to do their work. I mean, I support the younger investigators, I really do. But I think, senior people like me, and maybe like you, Bert, but you don't have to work. I just don't write a grant anymore because it would have such a miserably low opportunity to get funded. I think I can spend my time doing something better.
Yeah, I'm always disappointed when I hear investigators really complain and they wish they wouldn't have to write grants because I understand what you said about the funding situation and not getting funded, but to me, writing a grant is really a high form of a scholarship.
Exactly.
Of scholarship.
That's why I liked it. It
really is the essence of our career.
Yeah.
And I think that so I enjoy it. It's a pain to the not getting funded. I have to go back a second time, but I really do enjoy it, and I try to to my young colleagues and to students that they need to look at it that way, and if they can't look at it that way, then they ought to think about, well, is this the right field for me?
Well, I support that wholeheartedly. I write review articles now, and I gave last summer at the International Society for Arterial Chemoreception, our triennial meeting was held in Leeds, UK last summer. I gave a plenary lecture, which was an hour long, and you got to write a review article to get all that, and I did, and I enjoyed it because it was scholarship. Mm-hmm. You could bring things together. Yep. The poster I've got in the current EB here down below, there's far too much data in it. I made a big mistake there, but it brought together work that I had done up at the Meekins Christie laboratory at McGill.
That was a while ago.
Yes, it was, a long while ago, and with Sandy Howell. and a crazy man, Harris Russo's. But on respiratory muscles, of acid base, and the reason I did that was at the time we did those studies, everybody knows what happens to a muscle if it doesn't get enough oxygen, but it wasn't quite clear. What happens if it gets too much CO2, which happens in some cases of COPD and in other hypoventilatory situations. So we did a lot of work on that, and that's what's down there. That summarizes what must be about 9 published papers on that. But I agree, scholarship is really important. And writing a grant is one exercise of that. And it's got the added factor of it's very disciplined. You have to follow their format. And so I agree with you.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground, Bob, and it is a typical chat that you and I have had many times, maybe not this length at every meeting, but we certainly have an opportunity at every meeting. Is there anything that you would like to say to wrap it up?
I would like to say that although this interview has been about me, I really would like to turn the focus away from me and onto the younger investigators and give them, hooray, congratulations, I salute you. Please carry on. Do not give up. Just because your data might seem to be in conflict with the next person's data, do not give up. If those data were honestly, carefully gathered, then just say, okay, there's going to be a difference in data. I mean, there's species differences. There's differences in tissue. Even within the tissue, there's difference in the density of a receptor or of an ion channel. There could be all reasons, many reasons, why one set of data is disparate from another set of data. So do not give up. Do not give up. Hang in there. Perseverance is important.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that is that if there's a piece of data that's conflicting or a piece of data we can't explain, all that means is that we are not smart enough yet. There's some pieces of information that we don't have yet that if you keep at it, you'll eventually be able to piece this together. And I say that having that experience several times in my research career.
Yeah. Well, in the carotid body, I remember Nanduri Prabhakar, a magnificent investigator. Nanduri published some work with Saul Snyder at Hopkins that appeared to conflict with some data that I had published, but they were working with mice and with rats, and I was working with a cat. And so there was difference in species. And I said, I wasn't going to back down from my data, but they didn't coincide with what Nanduri had published. Yeah. Okay, well, this has been a wonderful session, Bert. I want to thank you for taking time out to ask me the questions, and I hope we can do so for years to come.
Yeah, well, Bob, I thank you for agreeing to be interviewed, to share your history, and for this living history in physiology, because I think these types of things, your views, the views of us that have been in it for years, can't be lost. They need to be put down somewhere so generations in the future can hopefully capitalize on them.
Exactly, and it's not so much the biographical details that I related to you, but it's the message to the younger investigators. Please hang in there and do your best. Intensity, focus, and discipline, with a sense of humor, too.